We ended up after a day or so in Denpasar at Kuta Beach. And Kuta Beach back in 72 was a very quiet place. There was the one hotel, the Hotel Bali Beach, which basically was there before the war, and then was destroyed during the war and was rebuilt at some point 10, 15 years or whatever after the war, and was the sort of the main hotel. But that was really the only bigger hotel at that time. But there were lots of, when I say lots, probably 10 or 20 little lodgements, little guest houses with half a dozen rooms, which I think they cost 400 rupees at that time, and it was at that time 400 rupees to the dollar. So it was basically $1 a night was what it cost.
I think while we were there, we were almost in a hallucinogenic, blissful state. The place where we stayed, the Garden Restaurant, was famous for serving mushroom omelettes. And we'd sit on our veranda and watch the hippies coming through and having their mushroom omelettes and going a little bit berserk and throwing things around and seeing things that weren't there. And after we'd been there for a while, we said, well, we should try this. And we asked Ibu to make us a mushroom omelette, and she refused. She said, it's not for you. So we've never ever had a mushroom omelette, never ever, because Ibu said it wasn't good. And I think she recognised that we were actually already blissed out. We were quite far enough down the track. But we just existed in this state of constant joy. I mean, even when I was, I don't know whether, I can't now remember whether I was so joyful when I was feeling sick.
Did you find that there were many people like yourselves there? Who were the tourists who were already there?
The only tourists we saw were people like us. There were only people like us and surfers. But yeah, we were meeting people, and you were swapping notes about where you'd been and where you were going to. So people who'd come across the Pacific would say, well, if you get to Fiji or if you go here. People who were already in Australia would say, if you went to Australia, if you go to Darwin at a campsite, blah, blah, blah. So it was a community of travellers, really, and that's how it felt.
But if there's a remote spot on the globe where the surf's good, you can assume some Australian surfers have already found it. They'd long since found Kuta, but that wasn't the real attraction for the serious surfing nomads. It was the huge reef break at Uluwatu.
And in those very first days, it was almost where's Uluwatu? And people would point to the bucket. And the bucket is the geographical mass that's southwestern Bali. And you'd get out there near the temple, and where's Uluwatu? And they'd point at the temple. So to actually find the surfer was almost, grab a machete and, just head off through the trail. I'm Terence 1R Fitzgerald, who was Terry Fitzgerald and still is at heart.
What sort of a surfer were you when you first went there?
Some people would say world class, but basically I was just trying to eke a living out of something I loved.
Groups of tourism pioneers in Bali would have been A, the surfers, and B, the overlanders. Those two groups, and they obviously interacted, but they were the surfers and they were the overlanders, and we were in the overlanders group.
The original reason we went there, my wife and I, we actually took my oldest son, who was 18 months at the time, was vacation, but also the surfing side of things. Places up there like Uluwatu and Padang, they're internationally famous breaks. And the plan was to use those places not only for, photographic reasons like editorial in magazines and movies and what have you, but also as a winter training ground for Hawaii, because even now, and particularly then, Hawaii was the rock by which you gauged yourself. Men were men and boys stayed on the beach, that sort of thing.
When I first met surfer, I think it was early 73, I think. People in Bali long time ago, they like to live inland, like, I guess, same anywhere else, People is not very familiar here with the ocean and the swimming and everything, because I guess the ocean was you know, it's make the Balinese people very nervous when they go to the beach.
Early days, yeah, it was pretty ethnic. You know, facilities weren't exactly first class or first world, but that just added to the program. You know, the Run Swim Run program of going up there and running from the top of the hill down to, say, Ulu, which at that time was like a 5K run. So for 3-4 hours, run back, go to town, do it again in the afternoon. You do that twice a day for 2 weeks.
Would you do that carrying your surfboard?
Well, we used to. The original days, yeah. We ran in carrying boards, and then it graduated to the local kids carrying the boards, and then that became a fee, and then it became a tariff, and then it became, you know, then it became blackmail because you didn't go surfing unless you had your board and that would mysteriously get lost.
Yeah, I think a lot of the hippie contact with Bali was was certainly done in a bit of a drug haze, so you can excuse the hippies who had too many magic mushrooms for really knowing what was going on behind the scenes. You have to understand that a lot of that contact was based around Kuta. Kuta had a bit of a history as being an area where you sent all the riffraff and the outsiders. It was a kind of not a normal place in Balinese culture, so in some ways it was appropriate to start a tourist industry there because it was slightly apart from the mainstream of Balinese culture. So for a lot of hippies who went there, what they were seeing was a new kind of development where surfing, eating magic mushroom omelettes, smoking dope was something that Balinese seemed to be interested in, but these were Balinese who came from other parts of the island to visit Kuta to see the exotic tourists. So it was two groups of people seeing each other as exotic.
And by the end of the 70s, the package holiday was becoming part of our lifestyle. International travel was getting easier and cheaper, and in Bali, the locals made it easier still.
But like anything, you know, every place changed.
Well, what I found when I went back in the 80s was, so it wasn't just a kooky little paradise for surfers and hippies anymore. And the conversations I had with people at a distant beachside resort that had mushroomed with development in the last year even were about what tourism does to a culture and whether Bali is now fucked up.
The first Bali book, 83 or early 80s. Early 80s. We did a separate book just on Bali, and I came back, and again we had kids then, and we'd sit down in one place with the kids for a week, and I'd do trips out from there, and then we'd move somewhere else and spend a week there and travel around from there. Now I remember going by Candidasa, which is the beach resort area. At that time there were no hotels there at all. It was just a beach, and I sort of went by and I got a motorcycle and stopped and looked at it and thought, nice beach, you know, and went on. And then a year or so later, started getting medicine people saying, why didn't you put anything in why didn't you mention the hotels in Candidasa? And I was thinking, there aren't any hotels in Candidasa. And they'd say, this restaurant. And I thought, this is crazy, you know. I went there. There were no hotels or restaurants. And I came back 2 years later, and this entire resort had appeared. And it was just like, you know, from nothing. It had just sprung up. And people often say, you know, oh, it's all your fault, you've ruined Bali, you know, you did these guidebooks, and if you hadn't done these guidebooks, these things would never have happened. And this place had just, you know, appeared without having anything to do with it at all. It had just suddenly, something spontaneously had caused all these Balinese to build these little hotels. And then, of course, Candidasa was the classic case of wrecking what you have.
Especially through the 90s. That's when the big change here. That's when the big business comes. Then all the five-star hotels are here. Then everybody's here.
All the money from Jakarta.
Yeah, all the big guys from Jakarta bringing all the money into the island, and the Balinese people get shocked with it because they couldn't cope with the changes. The changes was too fast.